Oh, we don't have to record yet.
Hey, it just
Fabulous. And Kari, I always forget to say, shall we hold questions till the end and then people can just raise their hands and somebody, you or me can, or Dee can call on folks? Does that work for you?
Yeah, I think so, because I have slides and sometimes it's hard on Zoom to see people's reactions. So, and I can revisit anything. So I think let's do that. I do have a fair amount of slides. I'm not going to be a total data wonk and just inundate you with data. I really do want this to be a conversation. And I also want to thank you all for your commitment to people on the planet and all of you here. John Wick, right? I just had a conversation with Charles Oppenheimer on the future of nuclear. It was very interesting. The grandson of Robert Oppenheimer. Very interesting conversation on the future of energy. And Audrey, when I start to talk about energy and policy, I'm sure that you will know much more than I assert. So please feel free, to weigh in later and advance that dialogue as such. I also just want to say that, I got my intellectual curiosity from the genes I inherited from my mother. So whatever I have to say, you can directly link to my mother's influence in my life, who has been profound, has never stopped learning. She probably would have an equivalent of 3 PhDs if she had been in school that long. She doesn't need to be in school because she is constantly learning and constantly teaching me. So I just want to share that and say thanks, Mom, for allowing me to be here today and to be with this group of people. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to share my screen and just jump in. And before I do, I'll just say that, I'm going to hit on some of the planetary data and where that comes from, talk a bit about the systems and the drivers behind it. And then importantly, sort of where do we go from here? What are and it's not going to be a straight line. There's no easy solution to complicated problems like climate change or the planetary crisis we're in, but to just kind of evoke some new ideas and consciousness about what might need to happen for us to sort of navigate our way through this next era, which is upon us shortly. So I'll just start with, didn't show up on my desktop. Hold on one second for some reason. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, I want to do, there we go. All right, how's that? You guys see that? Can you see the slide?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Never know with this. So the first thing is I just want to talk about, what we launched at New York Climate Week, which is the Planetary Health Check. It was the first one. And what do we mean by a planetary health check, which I'll get into a little bit. But I do want to call out my mentor and teacher, Johan Rockström. I'm not sure how many of you have met him or seen his documentary on Netflix called Breaking Boundaries, but he is the pioneer behind the Planetary Boundary Framework, which was launched in 2009. It's been updated in 2015 and then again in 2023, which was really groundbreaking because so much of the conversation has been about climate. So he introduced a new framework to understand how Earth systems work and how they work together to maintain the health of the planet. And there's been over 2,000 peer-reviewed papers now on planetary boundaries. It's a well-accepted framework. Still has a lot of science to go, still has a lot of challenges in the sense of how you operationalize it, which I'll talk about a little bit. But in the end, I think he is genuinely recognized as someone who is moving the needle for how we think about humanity's future and living on this planet, and in a way that sustains all life, not just human life, but all life. He was also awarded the 2024 Tyler Prize for Environmentalism. So with that, I'm going to start with where we are, which is this moment. So this has been called the the decade of decision. In other words, we have to make certain changes very quickly that will determine our path for our existence and other species. So, we have much to decide in the way of, do we want to do business as usual? And we can map that out. And I'll show you some of those, those data points, which aren't very enticing, versus what needs to happen for us to get to a point where all of humanity can live in a more just and sustainable way. And it's not utopia, because, I will assert that this is humanity's greatest longing anyway, that we're following a path that is being set by us through our neurobiological mechanisms of understanding what is it that we want, what is it that we need, and it's not necessarily what we're choosing. So my hope is that we're not too far past this dystopian message of, we're doomed, we're doomed, we're doomed, but that we will embrace this new era, which is quickly upon us, to get to something much greater and much better for humanity as a whole. So before I do that, I just want to say, let's look at history's past. I wish I could channel Johan, because when he shows this slide and he gives this presentation, it's so powerful. But we have to look, 400,000 years back and kind of confront this bias that, well, hasn't the Earth had these cold spells and these hot spells? Yes, it has. And the paleoclimatic records have shown this. However, I think it's really important to note that the hottest it ever got that we could actually detect in those records was just a little above 2 degrees Celsius. So the hothouse wasn't as hot as we may be looking at right now in modern humanity. But as these hot and cold spells went through, we ended up in what we call the Holocene level, which is really where life on Earth flourished. It's where vegetation and, all that we know from biodiversity really thrived on the planet 10,000 years ago. And this is when human civilization really came out of the sort of caveman era more so into more modern times. And this modern time is a long time ago. But let's get in the far right quadrant here into more modern times from 1850 on, which was the Industrial Revolution and the Great Acceleration. And what you can see here, and I just have to move you all because you're kind of on my far left side. Oops. What you can see here is that we are already in 2024, inching closer to the hottest point that it's been on Earth in the history of how it's been recorded by these records. And that these lines that extend beyond 2024 really show us multiple pathways. And I don't think there's any pathway that goes up from where we are that is something that humanity really wants to confront. So the question really is now, how do we flatten this curve, or bend the curve, as we say, or how do we limit the impact of overshoot, because we will overshoot 1.5, to something that allows us to right-size our economies, right-size our ways of living into a period where humanity can continue to thrive within a Holocene type environment. So have many of you seen this hockey stick slide before? I think the thing that's really interesting to me on this is that as human society evolved and as we became more prosperous, we'll call about the socioeconomic trends on the left, with the Earth system trends, there are, very synchronized parallels here in this hockey stick slide, which is as we got more wealthy and as things got more prosperous for humanity, it had major impacts on the Earth systems and nature more broadly as we think of it. And this is sort of what we're going to be seeing in the later slides about how this is showing up now in our current Earth systems. So, what I like to say in the slide with humanity, humanity's journey is when we started off, we were a small blip on a big planet, and now we're a big blip on a small planet, right? That is the Anthropocene, this era where humans are the major drivers of this change. And you can see how, our population growth and growth in general, underpinned by the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, have really led us to this point, which most people would say today is good. However, it's had significant impact, as you all know, on the health of the planet. So we are 1,000 times bigger than we were 500 years ago. I'm trying to get rid of it. I have a bunch of as of today, we are now outweighing, which is concrete, cars, people, and all the industrial processes that we have now outweigh all of life on Earth. And this is a major, major shift, and we'll get to this later, and why it's so important is because when people question, are we in the Anthropocene? I think this paper published in Nature really says, well, yeah, we are the dominant force on this planet by weight, right? By volume, by species. And so, you know, how do we right size this in a way that allows us to live, you know, in a more symbiotic way with nature, because this can't continue. It just can't continue because we rely so much on these systems. And if we look at wildlife population, many of you are familiar with this. It's been rapidly declining since the 70s. The report from WWF just, I think, this week or within the last 10 days is that we're at 73% decline, which is beyond sad. It's actually very dangerous. My background, and I didn't really get into my background, I started with human health and infectious disease. And genetic diversity is really important for the survival of species. And so when we start to see the diminishment of species, whether it's, you know, plant species or microbial species or large mammals or insects, this is really a threat to all living life on Earth. And so it is emotive in the sense that we don't want these animals to perish, but it's also at our own peril. And that's a really important part for us to understand, that we're part of this intricate web of life. So I play this, not that you don't know it, but it's important for a couple reasons. Number one, I hear a lot of, well, it's been hot before. Isn't this just an El Nino, you know, year or La Nino year? You know, aren't we seeing that an anomaly that will right size? And that's just not the case. And when it comes to where the most populous regions are, which is across this equator belt, India, Bangladesh, parts of Africa, China, right? This is where life-threatening heat is coming to play, right? In a way that it will significantly destabilize populations across the planet. So this isn't just a, you know, it's hot here. It is, if it continues to be this hot there, we're going to have mass migration and major geopolitical issues. Because it's just uninhabitable. You can't grow food. You can't have livestock. If you don't have air conditioning, you die. And I think one of the key indicators here that really jumped out at me was the nighttime temperature in Delhi, because it's really important for species to have a period of cool. So if it's going to be hot during the Sunday, when the sun's out, nighttime cooling is actually more important for survival than just the daytime heat. So when the heat is sustained through evening, that's when it gets very, very dangerous for human survival. So there's a paper coming out. It should be out, I would say, the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it's a carbon accounting framework. And what I really like about this, and this will come out from Johan's work at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, is that it starts to put just basic numbers. And so there are 100+ climate models out there, and they have certain assumptions in them, as all models do. And of those, which got us to the 1.5 threshold, is this assumption around what Earth can buffer, the planet can buffer, what we're able to capture in carbon capture technology, and what we're emitting. It's somewhat basic, but it's not, because as we start to look at Earth and how she's losing resilience, we're now seeing that she may not be able to buffer the 23.8 gigatons per year of CO2. In fact, I know from my time, and I'll talk about this a little bit, when I was in Brazil earlier this year, that the Amazon is moving from source to sink. There was a recent article in the last week about the Norwegian ecosystems that are not uptaking carbon the way that they had accounted for. And there are 118 governments in the world that are accounting for their carbon through these carbon sinks. And now there's a question, are these carbon sinks actually working? We also aren't in the gigatons of carbon capture, right? We're way smaller than that. So these climate models that have these assumptions in them are, again, a bit optimistic in what we're actually doing or what we can do over a period of time. But what is clear is what we're emitting. So I think the most recent report is that emissions went up by 1.5%. We're at about 40 gigatons of CO2, and we're having more methane and some of the other non-CO2 gases. So if our CO2 budget is 250 gigatons, you just do the math. We have 5 years. And we haven't seen a decline by 7% ever. So this is something humanity has to do in a rapid pace that it's never done. And that leaves the question, what does it mean, right? 1.5, right? It's not a goal, it's actually a budget, and I'll get to that. And I think it's also important to point out that most mass extinctions were linked to CO2 pulses, and we're in a CO2 pulse. We know that, right? We've been tracking and mapping. And so there's lots of data out there and papers that are published that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, which sounds really scary, and it should be, although many people aren't listening besides yourselves. So gratefully you are. But this is an accounting issue, right? The question of whether emissions and CO2 in the atmosphere has relevance to mass extinction is not a question of science. It's already been proven. And we're well on our way, unfortunately. The other thing that concerns the scientists is the issue of tipping points. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but I think the thing that I really wanted to call out here are these various scenarios. So we think, okay, we have the Montreal commitment, we have the Paris Agreement on 1.5, we have NDCs, which are national commitments to reduce emissions. And if we look at these scenarios, where we look at the current pledges and targets, or the 2030 targets, or the policies and actions of the real world, meaning what people are actually doing versus what they're committing to doing, we have untenable scenarios for humanity. Remember, we had just, pre-human time in the vacillations between Ice Age and hothouse, just breached 2.0. And now we're saying policy and actions get us to 2.7, close to a 3-degree world. That is just not a livable planet for the vast majority of humanity. So, even under optimistic scenarios, we're heading for an overshoot. And the question is, how long is that overshoot going to take? At what point will that overshoot hit up, its peak? And then how long does it take us to get back? And if you're not familiar with the tipping points, this is also something, when I talked about the climate models, the 100+ climate models and our budget, none of the tipping points are actually baked into those climate models. So if you think about the collapse of the boreal permafrost and its release of methane, or the tipping of the Amazon, where it went from, a carbon emitting scenario of 200 million gigatons or whatever it is, it's a lot. This is not a scenario that we have built into our models. And so this is the big question today right now, is the uncertainty ranges are way too wide in what those tipping points will be. Is it a 1.5 scenario? Is it a 3.0 scenario? But we know that there are 5 or 6 very, very close to tipping at 1.5. And we're close to 1.5. We're at 1.2. Even though we were 1.48 on an annual basis in 2023. So these systems are being stressed. Some of the recent data as of this week, really looking at AMOC, the Atlantic circulation, the conveyor belt that moves these ocean currents, has a massive effect on the United States and Northern Europe. but it also links, all the way into the glaciers. And I think what's important about tipping points and planetary boundaries, which I'll get to shortly, is that these systems are all deeply interconnected. I like to, since my background is in human biology and those systems, I like to think of it like Earth is a living system, and we have these subsystems, and we have to look after them. We can't look at one only at the peril of the others. We have to think how the planet works at a systematic level. The Amazon in particular, I was there for almost 2 weeks in May. Carlos Nobre, who's one of the leading researchers we work with closely, and we flew up to Belém, which is on the edge of the Amazon, and we drove for 4 hours into an indigenous community, and almost the entire way, the landscape looked like it did on the right, except with a lot more cattle. And it was like we were in the Amazon, but I felt like I was in Iowa. It was just crazy. Now, Paris State, where Belém is one of the most deforested areas from from particularly cattle farming. But the Amazon is in peril, and the ecologists and the climate scientists are arguing constantly, because if you look at the climate models, they have built in that we need about 3 to 5 degrees to tip the Amazon. And the ecologists say, no, it's more like a combination of 17 to 20% decrease in deforestation and about 1.5 to 1.7 before the Amazon tips into a Sahara. And we're really way too close because we're already at 17%. So we're seeing terrible fires. We're seeing changes in the atmospheric rivers, lots and lots of big bio changes in the Amazon, which, by the way, is not, as we know, as a major tipping point system, affects snowfall in the Himalaya. It affects rainfall in all other parts of the world. So again, this idea that it's a Brazilian issue or an ecosystem that in and of itself is worth saving, which it is, it's also vital to maintaining the stability of the planet. And then if your love of nature or your love for the planet, people, future generations isn't enough, we're going to be paying a dear cost. So this is a recent study that came out of the Potsdam Institute as well, probably about 6 months ago, that we're looking at about a $38 trillion per year by 2050, 18% loss in GDP. And these are basically what we would consider sunk costs. They're baked into already what is being lost through the loss of these ecosystems and a lot of the challenges that I'll touch on in a bit. So tipping points are real. That means 1.5 is a physical limit, or what we call a planetary boundary. So the planetary boundaries, as I mentioned, are these 9 biophysical processes that regulate the stability of the planet. Again, as someone who thinks about human systems, it's your neurological system, your cardiovascular system, your GI system. It's all these systems together that regulate the stability of the planet. And the spider diagram here is really showing us, just say red is bad and green is good at the simplest of levels. And since 2009 to 2015, what we've seen is a constant progression towards red. The only real boundary which has maintained and done well is ozone, which we know has been a great success story in environmentalism, of just being able to limit those ozone depleting particles and to protect that. But the rest are moving in the wrong direction. Novel entities, many of you talked about plastics. That's where plastics comes in the novel entities domain. 6 today, according to the last published paper, are breached. However, ocean acidification is right there. And probably in 2025, the next paper, you're going to probably see that moving into a breached category. And what's also important about these is if we think about the health of the biosphere, which is so important to maintaining and regulating the stability of the planet, one of the reasons the planetary boundaries makes such sense is these are feedback loops, as systems theory has taught us, right? They aren't linear things. One thing gets worse and then this gets worse. These are actually dynamic feedback loops, both positive and negative, And that's how the planet is regulated. So we look at these interactions, which are still very, very understudied and underappreciated. So it's something we'll be addressing in the research work ahead. But the goal is to get back to the green, the safe operating space for humanity, which is what most people want to know. Okay, it's bad. I don't like it. There's a lot of red. It doesn't look like humanity's going in the right direction. However, is there still hope? Can we get back to green? And the question, and to answer that simply is yes, we can. What it will take will be something humanity hasn't done. However, I think if we can raise our consciousness and help people understand what it will take and what's at stake, we can get there. And here's what it will take. Now, forgive all these complicated spider diagrams because the most important thing, again, is to follow the green. And, you know, if you follow the climate agenda closely or you follow the policy, you'll see a lot of focus on energy system transformations, land system transformations, NDCs, which are, again, the committed goals of countries versus current policies. Now, if we just stay with what are we committed to do and let's just do what we're committed to do, which is already going to be hard, we're still not there. Under current policies, we're definitely not there. If we just did energy, we're not there. What it's going to take is all of them at once. And that is if you can see here, this all transformations. This is the closest we're going to get to a safe operating space for humanity by 2050. It's doing all of it. Energy, land, sustainable production and consumption, which gets to your plastics, gets to how we live our life. That is a tall order. Very, very difficult. But at least we know there's an opportunity to do it, scientifically validated. And what we want to be able to help, and this is, you know, what we're launching in the future. One of you talked about En-ROADS, is to build this planetary monitor and planetary simulator, which is not a digital twin. It is actually taking remote sensing, Earth observation and modeling data, aggregating it and giving better resolution in, you know, local context to help with the decision making. And we want to do that through the full planetary boundary lens because we want to avoid some of the externalities that are missed when you focus on one domain versus others, or and I should say, to optimize impact. So to really look at how we get better outcomes across all 9 boundaries versus, say, just looking at one. And I would say at a very simplistic level, you know, energy transition and impact on the biosphere would be one of those where, you know, we have to be measured in our approach of how we're trying to achieve that. In a local context, and this is just give you a glimpse, it's in the process of being built. It's not built yet. So this is illustrative. It's to sort of dig into the different boundary domains as they show up in local context. But I think where I want to just pivot this conversation from, you know, what we're understanding in Earth systems and the planet as whole on its health and resilience is that climate change is not, or I should say planetary health, is not the problem, but a symptom of a larger dynamic and dysfunction. And here is a list of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Index from last year. So the color codes are green environmental, red societal, technological. You can see the legend at the bottom here to see what is the general consensus about where the risks are today versus where they're going. And if you just follow the color scheme, you can see that the environmental risks are going to be driving the risk landscape. And if you haven't heard of the poly crisis, this is actually something I'm studying in my PhD program at Georgetown. It is this causal entanglement, right? Which are these nonlinear feedback loops that are playing into how these crises are driving each other. So that even though we have to understand each domain well, we also have to appreciate from a systems theory that these are self-amplifying processes or they're emergent behaviors coming out of these systems that are driving a lot of the changes today. And I would also say that this is a very overly simplistic statement here, but if I were to bifurcate the world, I would say there's this sort of, you got to go all in, and we're going to be working towards zero emissions and totally renewable, which I'm one of those subscribers to. Nothing's wrong with the past model. There's no shortage of anything, right? It's business as usual. And these are sort of on the polar spectrums. And there may be middle ground here, but this is to illustrate a point that these two worldviews, which I'll talk about a little bit later, are really driving a lot of what's happening in our elections or policy across the board, in our economic frameworks, and more importantly, in our own personal mentality of how we're thinking about what we need, what we want, and what's actually achievable. And I show this because, you know, if you were to poll, you know, maybe I'm out of my realm here, but if you were to poll Americans today and say, what do you want? I want higher wages. I want things to be cheap. I want unlimited growth and profits. And you'd say, that sounds like a really sound, good economic policy. However, we have to understand, again, the system dynamics that are actually at the root of what could be the sixth mass extinction, or part of accelerating that, which is dollars need materials, materials feed energy, energy, you know, feeds the technology and innovation paradigm, but there are these externalities like pollution. And we feel, by feelings, I mean, what is the human perception of the systems that are driving this underlying challenge at a planetary scale, but also at a human existential scale as well. And it comes down to energy. And I just want to credit my friend, Nate Hagens from the Great Simplification podcast. If you don't listen to it, this is not a plug for him, but it's a wonderful podcast. He has amazing, amazing speakers, and he shared some slides with me. So I'm just going to channel Nate here, but also just talk about a lot about what we've talked about in the past, which is it's, you know, if you think about the hockey stick slide that I showed early on, where industrialization and population and everything took off, it really was because we made energy more efficient, and that was oil, right? That was the extractive oil industry. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If you just look at it from a base unit of energy, human to horse to a barrel of oil, this makes a lot of sense that it underpins a lot of the growth and acceleration that we've seen in the last 100 years. And if we take milk as an example, you can just see here the transition to automated milking quadrupled incomes. So, and this can be exemplified across many, many different domains where technology is the great accelerator at the cost of energy. And we've come to equate this sense of, you know, $1 of energy is $1 of whatever commodity. And that it's just not the case, right? Because there is a finite resource here at play, although it's not calculated in our economic systems. So again, there's this misnomer that we can continue to grow and grow and grow, and that there's unlimited energy, or there's no, untoward effects from how we use it in the impact it's having on the climate. And what Nate likes to say, and I agree wholeheartedly, is that there's this energy blindness. So on one side, we have what are all the things we need to sort of feed the beast, this super organism in the middle, which is all natural resources. And then what do we expect the same thing that gives us all this wealth to buffer to allow us to have the system we have here in the middle? So we have the source and the sink as our two bookends, and all of this in the middle is our economic system and our worldview about what we expect this to be. And this is where we really, really have a blindness that threatens our existence, is that we're not understanding the limitations of source, and we're not understanding the limitations of sink. The other thing I like to point out is what we call Jevons paradox, which is as things become more, we use the greener technology, a lot of the renewables, it hasn't actually decreased the use of fossil fuels, right? It has actually just increased the amount of energy available to power the economy, to power our world. So we're adding energy units. We're not necessarily substituting them. Most electricity that's fueled by renewables is 80% of fossil fuel use is not the energy, is not electricity. So in other words, we're creating more energy, but we're using more energy at the same time. So and the report that came out maybe last week or 2 weeks ago was that our fossil fuel use went up 1.5%. So we want to applaud the renewable effort, but the bottom line is we need to shift how we think about energy, growth, and sustainability instead of using more of it. And then we have these conflated, the proximate drivers of progress and growth with the ultimate drivers being money, technology, and politics. So again, really not rooted in what I would say reality about what the major drivers are or what our limitations to growth are, but what we perceive them to be. So in economics, we hypothesize or we think that it comes from existing capital. However, the reality is 80% of money is lent into existence. So banks don't lend money, they create it. And with access to fossil fuels, right, what we were able to do is really shift the curve. And our systems grew so fast and large, they didn't just, the old economic paradigm, and I should refer to some of our experts here on this webinar, it pushed the curve to the far right. And since we couldn't explain it through the old traditional mechanisms, we called it capital and labor. And then if we use the social construct of credit, we pull the resource consumption forward again in time. So we keep pushing this more dollars, even though we're not really marrying it up with what we need from a sustainability perspective or what's available from an energy use or an appropriately priced energy unit cost. So what we have today as a result of this is a society that views the world through a financial lens. We've not only financialized the human experience, but also the explanation of it. And I think I see this happening in these last days of this election, which is so, upsetting to me personally, because I think so much, many people, I'd say the vast majority of people don't really understand the economic drivers of progress or even what we consider to be progress really driving us in the wrong direction long-term. Not even long-term, maybe even shorter term. So we get back to the poly crisis, which is, money, politics, technology. None of those are bad in and of themselves. It's more how our systems have been set up to look at these proxy indicators of success, which are leading us to in this very, very complicated web of interconnected risks, which are only projected to get worse and more expensive. And I would just say, and I'm going to get a little bit more into the mindset, the worldviews that are driving it, which is, coordinate towards more, spend more, and then follow the others, right? So what does success look like? We are humans. We do have these mirror neurons. We do look to our peers, and we've set these parameters around what life should look like and who we are, and we're following, right, this false narrative about what success is and even how to define that. So, if we continue on this paradigm of surplus, keep following more is better, I think we know how this turns out. And I say this because in 1972, there was a book published called The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome. If you haven't read it, it's very, very interesting because this is before complicated, climate models and supercomputers and everything, but it's been phenomenally precise. And 50 years later, they did this update. And I read this book when I was on vacation this summer. I wouldn't recommend it as a vacation book, though. And it was just fascinating. And one of the chapters in there that I found so interesting was the chapter on Russia. And, you know, early on in other aspects of my career, I had some interactions with Condi Rice, and we were talking about Russia and some of the just major demographic shifts there. And I had never made the connection between Russia had really hit the limits to growth early with their natural resources. But in this book, they kind of do a really deep dive on that, which is super interesting and has relevance to many other economies and as we think about growth. But the bottom line is 50 years ago or today, the urgent action is now because these trends are here and they're here real time. So, you know, it does come down to, we live in the anthropocentric era, right? These are human-driven changes, which means that we have the potential for humans to have not only the negative impact that we're seeing, which I would subscribe as largely unconscious, to one that is more pro-social and can have us work towards more what we call positive tipping points, which is through the awakening, through the consciousness process, really understanding how the choices we make, not just individual, but has to be at the societal level, are really defining the future for all of us. And unfortunately, biology actually is much, much slower than culture, you know, or societal changes, particularly since the Great Acceleration. So our brains are still somewhat wired to, you know, feeding ourselves, being socially connected. However, I would say it's been really co-opted by a consumer mindset in the sense that our behaviors are plastic, meaning we have these mirror neurons. You know, culture happens, again, this is what I was just saying before, happens at lightning speed versus our biological evolution. We haven't caught up, in other words, to realizing what path we're on and why it matters. And maybe the best example of that today is our political process and what's happening in the United States in this election, which to many people seems absurd, but this is a phenomena of what we're seeing here at a societal level with, you know, our minds, our mindsets, our consciousness not really being able to understand both the problems and solutions and how it will impact us. And this shows up a lot as tribalism, as many of you know, but this is something, again, in the history of our existence was a potent driver of how we survive. We're not the strongest, the fastest, you know, name it, you know, of all the animals in the kingdom, but when we formed groups, we were strong. And so this tribal instinct in us, which is deeply biologically rooted, is sort of a driver of what's also working against us. Again, we don't have that evolutionary perspective to take in the complexity of life, the systems, you know, what even science is teaching us, because we still are biologically evolving to this more complex understanding of who we are relative to all other living things or to existence itself. And so we have this, what I say, like a hijacked brain, right? The consumer culture has sort of hijacked our need for social connection, our need for food and shelter into these consumer behaviors, which are the wanting and having and this immediacy, hijacking our dopamine systems. And we're not really consciously aware of the choices we're making or what the consequences of those choices are, both individually and collectively. And close to the end here, so thank you for your patience. But what I'm studying in my PhD program at Georgetown is really looking at this worldview, this idea of the evolved brain, of consciousness, of what quantum physics is teaching us about the relationality of all life. And, you know, and love, which is not a new concept, and I don't mean it in the romantic, sentimental self, I mean it as a force of nature, is a major driver in the evolution of the universe. And I think that this in and of itself, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with quantum, but, you know, there's a huge amount of mystery now in understanding how the universe expands through dark energy, what the quantum vacuum is, why do we have 3 quarks per proton and neutron, why do these quarks stay together, what's a neutrino? I mean, there's just so much mystery, even though we have good understanding and great ways of measuring things. The basic, I would say, shift in the scientific field is going from a Newtonian Cartesian thinking of, if you break things down into their smallest parts, you can understand it, to more of this relational systems thinking, which is more in line with deep ecology, that systems have this emergent behaviors. And we can see this with consciousness, right? We can't explain consciousness by studying the brain. I worked for 5 years with the Brain Research Institute at Hopkins, and I can tell you, we didn't figure out consciousness, even though we studied lots of brains and neurons, and we had organoids and all kinds of fancy science. So what is that emergent behavior or that emergent property, I should say, that comes out of the brain that can be seen also at a systems level, and also at a mega system, a systems level, like I talked about in the polycrisis. So I feel like this transition from we're discrete, we're tribal, it's win-lose, it's more is better, is really about the brain's inability to catch up with where reality is, and really where science is as well. And I wrote this piece in Medium, which is part of my thesis, which is there are 2 major systems at play, both at the individual level and at the cosmic level. One driven by fear, which gets to scarcity, tribalism, and violence, which I worry that we are in. And there's a very attractive kind of drug-like substance with fear, because the brain is geared to pay attention to things that are scary. So it will override higher levels of consciousness if it's afraid. So if we think about media, we think about, many of the narratives that we face today, it keeps us stuck in this do loop of fear, which doesn't allow us to think more broadly, to see the connections that are there. I, however, think that love is a generative force, which leads to a more expansive, connected universe, which leads us to take decisions at an individual and societal level that will help us ensure the survival of our species and many others. And then finally, when you say, what is it actually going to take? I could spend 4 hours on policy. I could spend, any number of hours on any issue from a systems perspective on what needs to change. But in the end, it comes down to something very simple, which is humanity simplify, right? We have finite resources, and we need to respect the balance of that. And more is not better. And honestly, it will lead to a more fulfilled life. In other words, we have a crisis of meaning and purpose. This simplify is not just a bumper sticker, right? That sounds good with all the other platitudes on it. It actually is what we need, both from a true mental health and well-being perspective, but also from a deep ecology perspective, to live in cohesion with nature. So that is where I end, and I'm happy to take questions.
I'll jump in if I could on that. And Kari, this is excellent. I have been following the planetary boundaries for a short time, and have started to sharpen my focus a bit because of that. Also, I'm a recent fan of Nate on that. So I would also say sign up for Nate's podcast. What my big concern is that not only is there a lack of awareness of the higher level problem, but even things like the condition of a heating planet. I just attended a one-day workshop with a bunch of healthcare planners on Friday, and much of it was focused on extreme heat. And there are more people globally and in the States that die of extreme heat and related things than any other natural disaster. And yet nobody knows it because you don't see the effects of it. Go back to Chicago in 1995, where almost 1,000 people died of a 3 or 4 day heat wave. Okay. The big problem is that even FEMA doesn't recognize heat waves as a disaster, even though they kill more people than other disasters. So we're missing the point on that. And it's going to get warmer and warmer and warmer, and it's going to get worse and worse in every year, especially for those folks in frontline communities. So, a lot of things have to be addressed here. My big concern is, what do we do for the people that are suffering now, and are going to be a lot more of them over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That worries me, and that probably is the motivation of my heart space to work in here is not only the inequity of who drives the problems versus who suffers the most from them, but also I just think that what will it take for humanity to wake up to many of the things that you have woken up to, right? How far down does it have to go before we start to see these patterns and understand? So I don't really have an answer to that, except that I share your concern. And so far, it seems that our narratives and data has not been effective in really hitting at the systems level required to start to address some of that really in a more proactive way.
Kari, this is John Wick. Am I unmuted there? There we go. I was lucky enough last night to be at dinner with an individual who is now in Sarajevo, dealing with NATO leaders, trying to figure out ways to better negotiate activities around the world and things that are happening. And we got into a long discussion about leadership. You mentioned territorial consciousness. If we look at territorial consciousness and we take the concept of trying to describe or enlighten or challenge leadership in different areas to come together and begin to focus on this particular issue, the tipping points, what would you suggest would be the best way to work with those leaders and give them enough information so that they suddenly recognized the depth of this problem? Because we're really on a very short fuse right now.
I mean, that's a great question, and it's kind of a magic wand thing for me, which is I'd love for all of them. I don't know how unaware they are, but I think the political pressures today are inhibiting their ability to make those right decisions for humanity. I would like, and I had this conversation in Palo Alto this week at a meeting with some foundation heads saying, where we need that message coming from is from the moral leadership in the world. Who's listening to these voices, right? Where are these influential voices? And I don't mean it from just TikTok and whatever. I mean, the Muslim leaders, the Catholic leaders, the whatever leaders, right? Where are their voices coming together in unison to help humanity understand this issue, which is deeply moral? And it is also political, but political will also starts with, a will for something different or a will for something better. And by better, not meaning more growth, more this, more that, more everything. We know that is not a good track for us to be on. So I think it's moral leadership we need, and whether or not that's political today or not, it should be something that we aspire to. But I'm not sure the democratic systems today, the way they're set up, are really getting those moral leaders in that position. And I'm not saying anything against any of the leaders out there who aren't taking a stand, but it is whose voices are being listened to today, and are we able to collectively get those voices together in a way that will open up people's minds to different ways of living and voting and everything else. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's political, and it's also more at the moral level as well.
Ted Speckler has had his hands up for a long time. Would you like him to unmute and ask his question?
Thank you.
I'm
And
glad
then
you
Judy
suggested
after that.
unmuting. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. By the way, Jill, this is fantastic. You should get an award for these programs. They're wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Uh, the
I'll pass that back to
Yeah,
Lindsay, who's the mom, but thank and D too.
I was just wanted to mention a horrible research paper just recently came out by statisticians who say there is no statistical evidence of any warming of the earth. Now that sounds insane, but then you see what they did. They went all the way back for millions of years, and they took all the changes that have gone on for millions and millions and millions of years. And after they put that into statistics, they say, what we've just recently seen is not significant. So be careful. The bad guys are going to climb all over this report.
Yeah, Ted, you know what? There's a Nate Higgins has a Frankly. He has a Frankly on that paper. It's called Climate Change Isn't Real. Listen to it, because it actually addresses that, because they smoothed the curves because they went back so far that it made it look like they weren't real anomalies. But I think Nate did a really good job in his podcast. In his Frankly, it's called Climate Change Isn't Real, and it addresses that exact paper.
Good.
Thank you. Judy, I think you were up next.
Thank you. So I'm taking off on the moral leadership end of things and how that's affected me and what I do. When I found out a bunch of Quakers in Philadelphia had a really good program to address things to large companies that can say yes or no to a problem. They're not dependent on the government to make a decision, because I think a lot of people right here would agree, if we wait for all the governments to agree to do something, which is what we've been doing, it's not getting done. So what can common citizens do? Well, this particular band of Quakers said, let's go after PNC Bank, because behind the scenes, they're funding mountaintop removal coal mining. What can we do about it? And after 5 years and hundreds of different actions, we got PNC to stop doing that bad practice. Now we're after bigger things. So we are saying, hey, Vanguard, you're doing a lot of things you have control over, you have influence over. As one of the third largest asset managers in the world, you could affect the way you're handling fossil fuels. And we are demanding that they do that. So we're a few years into that campaign. I'll put equate.org in the chat and check it out, because we're pretty damn effective and we're going to get somewhere. We're not going away.
I think you, Judy, you hit on the heart of the matter, which is it comes down to money, right? I just recently ensured that my portfolio had no fossil fuel.
Yep.
More of the RFIT funds,
Yep.
Not only it's smart, because we're going to need that, by the way, because there is a limit, and, I mean, it's smart investing, not just because it's good for our future and the planet, but it's also just smart investing. So, money is at the heart of this. The economic system is the heart of it. And I think hitting it there is really effective. We need a lot more people to be doing what you did and affecting that. And that gets to the moral leadership.
Yep.
So can I ask a question on that, Judy? That Equate is pretty much a Society of Friends / Quaker group.
It was started by Quakers. It's still pretty much a Quaker-led group, but I'm not Quaker, and they have thousands of people and a big budget now. So, so no, it's not all Quakers, but started and
So kind of, yeah.
with that nonviolent direct action concept.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, just to back up, we have, Dee and I have had them on our list to be a presenter at some point, so they're
Yes.
moving up the list there. and
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
As a Quaker, I feel like, have to give them a little bit of time, airplay.
Excellent.
But to that point, Judy, I'm reminded of there are other groups out there that kind of give me hope a little bit. I mean, this talk tonight, Kari, I hate to say it, but it's eye-opening and scary, but there are good things happening out there. And there's another national group called As You Sow that's, trying to raise awareness and stuff. And then there's, we've been following closely bunch of the attorney generals and others have been suing big plastic and big packaging for the overuse of single-use plastic and also big oil, because both big oil is linked to big plastic, because as Kari talked about, as electrification grows, instead of the use of energy going down, it's actually being shifted into the use of plastic, because what's plastic made out of? Oil and natural gas. They had to find new markets for that. So the growth of plastic use is actually, linked to, in a bad way, all of that. But anyway, the attorney generals are suing Exxon and also big plastic for the fact that they knew decades and decades ago about the impact of their industries, and yet they hid it from the public. But anyway, I also have hope because we started a youth environmental summit here in Delaware, and the kids give me hope because they are aware, even at the high school level, and they definitely, at least some of them, I can't speak for all of them, but some of them, there's a growing movement, I sense, like against fast fashion and things like that. So I do have hope there. But my question for Kari, if you don't mind, I have two things. I just wanted to mention, I was so interested to hear what you said about just, growth, and because I've long thought that our dependence on the use of GDP, I'm not an economist, but like when I hear on NPR or, every week or whatever, when they talk about, oh, the GDP, blah, blah, blah. And it's like this huge statistic that everyone clings to about the health of our economy. But if you look at what makes up the GDP, it's not, it doesn't represent so much of what's actually going on behind the scenes in those numbers. So Kari touched on that a little bit. And if you want to say more, that'd be great. And I just wanted to ask you, when you first started talking, I thought, and you mentioned the ozone, we all rallied around the issue of the ozone layer and seems to have made a difference there. So why are all the things you talked about tonight, why are we not approaching climate change in the same way as we all rallied around the ozone issue?
I mean, if I could answer that, I'd win a Nobel Prize. But I have a point of view, which you can just take as a point of view. A couple things that you speak to, but in general, I think it covers both, which is that a lot of this stems from worldview and language and consciousness, right? We have a language that says that our economy is good when GDP goes up. We have a language that says, I want more, cheaper, better, faster. And I think that until those narratives change, until there's a new language, and we can get behind what's driving those narratives. And I think there's, some level of, I'll give some level of, ignorance in the true sense, not ignorant from a judgmental, but not knowing. And also a lot of, interests from industries like oil that are driving these narratives too, that we need to create those new narratives. The future we want, not the future that we're getting. And I think most people today, and even if you polled across America, they're not happy with the way things are working for themselves, but they don't understand it. And climate gets lost in that, right? It's just seen as a distraction from the things that they worry about, like their next meal and how to pay for their childcare, or how to get good health care, or, you know, how to afford a house. I mean, the things that in the Maslow hierarchy of needs, you're not going to get to the different levels of you know, thinking at the existential level if you're still worried about what you need to eat and where you're going to live and how your kid. So that's why I say this is largely an issue of consciousness and narratives and purpose and meaning, where my hope is that, you know, out of crisis, new things arise, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. And if things are going to get worse before they get better, well, then let's have it, right? Let's let it get worse to get better, because at the rate we're going, it's like the boiling frog. We're going to be dead before we know it. So, you know, I don't wish that, and I don't wish suffering on humanity, because none of us want that, right? At the same time, we do need a massive awakening. And GDP is just one of those proxy indicators that says that we don't really know what we're talking about. We just have been told that that's the thing that we should be focused on.
There are a few people in mute who were actually waiting with their hand raised, like John Sykes and Audrey. Well, John lowered his hand. How about Audrey?
No, I'll jump in. I took
Okay.
that as an invitation. Yeah, you're right, Carrie, on a number of things on that. The GDP is always one that comes up, and it's like we don't do well unless we grow. We have to grow faster than anybody else. So it's a big political number that folks look at. Also, another one that probably bothers everybody here is that we've been very proud about, at least some of the folks in politics have been very proud that we're making more, we're drilling for more oil than anybody else. You know, so it's that oil independency, which really is a big problem there. We talk about a change of attitude. If you go back to World War I and World War II, folks stopped buying things. They were told that they had to save things. They had to save money. They had to grow their own food, because there was an enemy out there that we had to save our precious resources to be able to fight against. But you know, a lot of folks had Liberty Gardens. You know, a lot of folks kept tinfoil and aluminum. I guess it was tinfoil back then, but all sorts of stuff like that. We were able to do that in a short period of time because the focus was on we have an enemy out there. And that got a lot of people, government programs to start reduce and to save. Lately, you know, the politics aren't allowing that. You know, the other guy is talking about the enemy within the country. You know, so that's a hard one. There was a film that came out a couple of years ago called Kiss the Ground, which was pretty good, and talked about the value of the earth, of agriculture, if used properly, could sequester more carbon on it as well. A new one is out called Common Ground, and I'll put a plug in for my church, the Unitarian Universalist down in Lewis, and we're going to show on Saturday a free showing for that. And it's another one. This one focuses on big ag and all the money that is coming out of big ag and all the waste that's being used and all the politics and the power that are behind big ag. You know, so I put the info in the chat if anybody is down this neck of the woods and wants to come in on Saturday at 7 to the church for that. And I will add one last thing, and because I think Dee had talked about the youth movement, and I mentioned this very early on that the Interfaith Power and Light group now has coming up our 4th annual youth essay contest on environment. It's called Renew. And every year we double the amount of kids that write about the environment and the responsibility of youth and why they like it, why they're worried about it as well. these kids are smart, and every year when we've had the awards, we've taken some of the award winners out to Lake Hall so that they can be in front of the Senate and the reps on that. And every year they've gotten standing ovation for being there, because those folks who are sitting in those seats know who the voters are coming up. So when you get the kids involved, they know. And a lot of them are upset because our generation has given them a very heavy challenge that they're probably not going to be able to overcome with just one generation. This is like a century problem it's going to take to get past that. So the good news is that the kids do believe, a lot of them do, if they're given the chance to talk about it. And there are things that are happening at different levels. So I'll just let it go at that.
Thanks, John. Audrey and Marion, you guys want to go, and then I'll do some
Okay,
final.
Audrey first.
Oh, thank you, Marion. So Kari, just such a wonderful presentation to our group. So thank you. I'm sure that Jill and Dee will say this too, but just so thought-provoking, and your great slides were, wonderful. I really thought that the tipping point slide stuff was, I wish I could show that to some people I've spoken with. There were just two things I wanted to kind of hit on. One is that we found it very useful sometimes in advocacy to emphasize that the link between GDP and fossil fuel energy use in advanced economies has been broken to some extent, that you can in fact use less fossil fuels and still have economic growth as measured by GDP, which our elected officials at least care deeply about. Very I always like to be able to say, well, you can actually reduce CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions and still have GDP growth, and that's what the advanced economies have been doing lately. And that kind of speaks to the different timeframes that are needed for sort of like the urgency of the action to reduce the nearest tipping point, if you will, and versus the time frame that we need for the evolution of planetary consciousness to, and our human consciousness to catch up with the way that we need to think to actually survive, in the world that we inhabit. And so there's like, I'm kind of bifurcated. I wish we had you in a book group or something so that we could just talk, at least once a month. But there's this, jobs and GDP and stuff that already matters to people, language that they can listen to. And then there's the, spiritual consciousness, which maybe is the higher value. And for that, I just wanted to plug a book that I think you might enjoy, which is Cosmic Judaism by Rabbi Barry Silver, who actually, passed away last spring. So might not have been edited to the extent that it would have been had he not been sick. But it's I'm in the middle of reading it right now, and it's might be more of, given the stuff you've been looking at, it might be more of one of your fun reads.
Audrey, say the name of it again, please.
Oh, I can put it in the chat here, and then I can cede my turn to someone else.
Just say what it is.
Cosmic Judaism, and it's by Rabbi Barry Silver, and it is available on Amazon.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you have any thoughts about that, Kari? Or
I do, but I wanted to ask Audrey or Marion. I'm sorry, Audrey. Just Marion, why don't you ask your question, and then I'll try to answer or just comment on all three.
Okay, I was thinking that maybe the major problem that we have, or one of the major problems, is actually the capitalist system. It has built into it, make bigger profits, keep growing. And that's a fundamental aspect of it. I'm not really even sure that it possesses the capabilities of getting around that, because that's what it's all about. I don't know whether we should go to a socialist system or just invent something that seems to be a need, because we're going towards really the destruction of our species and other species in so many different directions all at once. We really need to take action and do something radical now, or there won't be any human beings left, and we'll take down all of the mammals and the other animals around us, the vertebrates. It'll go back to maybe single-celled individuals surviving somewhere or other that are good at functioning in hostile systems. Okay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we need a few hours for that. I would just say, Marianne, that I think one of the limits to our vision of the world we want is language. So even if you use the word socialism, you're going to get so much pushback against that. We can't use that word. We have to find new language for the world we want versus the world we have. Right now, you're right, capitalism reigns, right? Money reigns. And Audrey, to your point, I'm working with Senator Whitehouse. I have 25 million new appropriation and for tipping point science. You know how we did it? We didn't say the word climate. We talked about the economics. We talked about jobs. We talk about, so we have to use whatever language we have today that works in the social construct that we have to work with. And then we have to evolve it, right, to new types of language, new types of consciousness, which is a longer term play. However, if we look at the history of humanity and all the trials and tribulations and, plagues and whatever that's happened, let's not be too afraid of a crisis to wake us up, right, to help us form that new language. I don't want it. I would much rather have a much more policy coherent, systems-based, data-based approach to what we're doing. But I don't know that humanity is going to wake up fast enough, right, to that. And that is my concern, right? That it may have to get worse before it gets better. But the good news is people like yourselves are at the forefront doing your part. We're all doing our part to help bring in those new systems, those new ways of thinking, those new insights, that new language that is so desperately needed to connect people and make them feel like there is hope. It just might be tough getting to the next version of whatever humanity's place is on this planet.
And we're hopeful that it happens quicker than we hope. But I just am taken, oops, I'm muted, yapping away here. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted.
No.
You're good.
This is the first time you've really heard that, the hurricanes were caused by climate change was, with Helene, and I've already forgotten the one that went through Florida. I mean, that was the first time the news really talked about climate change. But I was kind of taken by your two circles, the one of which was fear. And I do think that seems to be a driving force. And I think it's kind of an amorphous one, because all the political things are economic, cost of, education, cost of housing, blah, blah, blah. And I just think there's a lot more of that is, fear of the future, that, people don't jump out and say climate change. They don't say, international struggles are a problem, but I do think that fear is kind of a root cause. And if we need new language, I like your language of love and hope. Judy, did you have a question? Or are you waving?
No, I'm just trying to say thank you, and I'm going to leave right now. So good job.
Okay, and you get to talk to all your folks at Ollie. So that is very cool.
Yeah.
That is very cool. before everybody checks out, Dee, you want to talk about who's going to be our November speaker real quick?
Sure. So November will be James Browning, who was the regional director of Common Cause back when I actually was the Delaware manager for the Delaware chapter. And so I worked with him closely. He then went on to found and become the executive director of an organization called F-, which is using a database of state level lobbyists regarding upstream and midstream oil, gas, and coal interests to demonstrate the extent to which these lobbyists, influence policy and bring about the climate crisis in their work and their effect on policy. So I know it'll be a really good, interesting talk and timely with the election will have just been passed, but we're looking forward to the new legislative session in Delaware. So Delaware does not rank very well when it comes to those that do lobbying in Delaware and those that accept money from them. So come join us and learn more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Carrie,
very much.
such wonderful thanks. And I just, I'm looking at the folks here who many answers or solutions. A lot of the folks on this call seem to be involved in some political action, and we all met this afternoon. So we're looking forward to the election, which I think will be a huge step, at least not backwards, in addressing the climate issue. So thank you for all your fabulous work, and I look forward to catching up with this Nate gentleman, Hager. And Lynn, Mom, thank you so much for having such a wonderful child. So exciting, so exciting. So, and I hear you have a daughter getting married?
I do this Saturday in San Diego, and we'll all be out there. Yeah.
There you go. Well, have a wonderful, wonderful wedding, and we hope to have you back again sometime.
Sounds good.
Thanks a
Carrie,
lot.
thank you so much,
Thank you.
Thank
Carrie.
you all for being here. Thank you, thank you.